Being a parent means protecting your child from the monsters in the world. But what happens when you can't find the monster because it's hiding inside your child? Or worse, inside you? Tonight, you'll hear 3 true first-person accounts of parenthood pushed beyond the brink, stories of quiet disappearances, terrifying transformations, and the unbearable truth that sometimes love isn't enough to save your family. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real memories, fractured, unshakable, and told by those who lived through them. But be warned, these aren't stories you'll forget. These are the ones that follow you into your child's bedroom, that whisper in the dark when you're tucking them in, that force you to ask, do I really know who I brought into this world? Let's begin. Story 1 of the Monitor. It started like every other exhausted night of new parenthood. The kind where the walls seem to close in and the exhaustion turns every moment into a dull haze. Our daughter, Lily, had finally fallen asleep in her crib after a long bout of colic, and I collapsed onto the couch with the baby monitor in hand, relieved for a moment of silence, the small green LED flickering gently with each sound from the nursery. But that's when I noticed something off. Something subtle, something that didn't register as wrong until later, until it had already started. On the monitor, the audio would occasionally pick up faint, rhythmic clicking, not loud or threatening, but methodical, like fingernails tapping against wood, and though I chalked it up to interference or the monitor's notoriously cheap hardware, it kept happening every night at roughly the same time, 2:38 a.m., and each time it happened, Lily would wake up moments later screaming inconsolable, as if startled by something I could never see. Eventually, I swapped out the monitor for a newer, supposedly interference-proof model, and for a few nights it was fine, quiet, peaceful, normal, until one night I heard the clicking again, sharper this time, faster, and this time it was accompanied by what sounded like whispering. Low and deliberate, and though I couldn't make out the words, the cadence was unmistakably human, and it wasn't coming from the baby, who was completely silent and still on camera, but from something just off screen, just beyond the camera's frame. I remember rushing into the room, heart pounding, expecting to catch some intruder or malfunction, but Lily was sound asleep, completely unharmed. The room empty and undisturbed, but when I looked at the monitor's playback footage, what I saw made my blood go cold. For 5 full minutes before I entered the room, the monitor showed a shadow moving slowly across the floor, long-limbed and almost spider-like in its articulation, dragging itself to the edge of the crib and rising slowly over it. Watching Lily silently before retreating just as I opened the door, we called the police, of course, and they reviewed the footage with skepticism, chalking it up to a trick of the light, a compression artifact, even though I knew what I'd seen wasn't a glitch, wasn't an illusion, and that something but had been in our home. From then on, I refused to leave Lily alone at night, taking shifts with my husband to watch her sleep, but the events escalated. She began waking with bruises in the shapes of handprints on her arms, bruises too large to be from a child and too deliberate to be accidents. And when we confronted our pediatrician, she hinted at possible sleepwalking injuries or even neglect, implying things we couldn't bear to hear. But we knew something was entering her room, something was touching her, and when we moved her crib into our room, thinking proximity would help, the monitor began picking up the clicking noises directly outside our bedroom door, slowly pacing back and forth, night after night, while Lily whimpered in her sleep and I sat clutching a kitchen knife under the blankets, terrified out of my mind and helpless to stop it. One night I snapped. I left the monitor on record mode and stayed up the entire night staring at the screen, and at 2:38 a.m., right on cue, the clicking began louder than ever, and this time the door creaked open on camera, not in real life, not that I heard, but on the monitor. It swung slowly open, and in crawled the same shadowy figure, now clearer, more defined, impossibly tall and thin with a face that seemed blurred, like the pixels themselves refused to render it properly, and it crawled directly up to the monitor camera, leaned in so close that its face filled the screen, and whispered one word in a voice like static and fire. "Amina." I screamed, waking my husband and Lily, and the monitor immediately went black, never to function again, no matter how many times we reset it or replaced it. We moved shortly after that, telling ourselves it was just stress, that we'd been hallucinating from exhaustion. But Lily never stopped flinching at dark corners, never stopped waking at 2:30 a.m., and now, years later, she's begun drawing pictures of a long man with too many fingers and dranners, a mouth where his eyes should be, telling us he still visits sometimes, but only when we're asleep, and only when the lights are off, and that he still whispers the same word every time he comes. The word that keeps me awake night after night, staring at her bedroom door and wondering if one night, it will creak open again, and this time I won't be fast enough to stop whatever waits beyond it. Story 2. The Substitute. When my son Ethan was in 2nd grade, he started coming home quieter than usual, not upset, not visibly distressed, just quieter, like the volume had been turned down inside him. His usual stories about school reduced to monosyllabic replies. His energy curdled into something muted and hesitant, and I figured maybe it was just a phase, something developmental. But after the 3rd week, I noticed he'd begun drawing pictures that disturbed me, not because they were grotesque or violent, but because they all featured the same figure, over and over. A tall woman in a dress with no face, just a smooth oval where the features should have been, and always drawn holding Ethan's hand in a classroom, surrounded by children who were either scribbled out or staring at the floor. When I asked who she was, he said simply, "That's Miss." And when I pressed for more, he shrugged and added, "She teaches us now, when the lights go off," and I assumed it was some kind of creative make-believe, maybe an imaginary teacher they invented during playtime. But something about the way he said it made my stomach knot, like he wasn't telling me a story, but a memory, one he didn't quite understand. I reached out to his school the next day, asked if they'd had a substitute or a change in staff, and the secretary told me no, his regular teacher, Mrs. Carver, had been there every day without fail. But when I asked Ethan again that night, he looked genuinely confused and said, "Miss Carver's never there when it's dark," and I asked him what he meant by a dark, and he explained in that eerie, childlike, matter-of-fact tone, "Sometimes the lights go off for a long time, and then it gets cold, and Miss teaches us until the bell rings. But we're not supposed to tell anyone or she gets mad." And that was the first time I felt true parental panic claw at my chest, not just fear for my child's safety, but fear that I was being told something real through a child's limited lens. And I didn't know how to respond without either encouraging a delusion or missing a hidden danger. I emailed Mrs. Carver directly and asked if there had been any issues with power outages, substitute instructors, or odd behaviors in the class, and her reply was terse and odd. "No issues to report. Class has been completely normal," followed by a line that I initially thought was a mistake. "Please do not pursue this any further, for the safety of all involved," which I reread 5 times before realizing she had either typed it deliberately or was trying to warn me without directly stating something. And when I went to the school in person the next day, they told me Mrs. Carver had taken an unexpected leave of absence and was unreachable, and that her classroom was closed for a maintenance, and they assured me Ethan was in good hands with a certified interim teacher. But when I asked for a name, they became evasive, saying the sub was part of a rotating program and not assigned long-term, which felt like a lie. I pulled Ethan from school temporarily and took him to a child psychologist, hoping to untangle what he was saying in a safe environment. But during the 2nd session, the therapist pulled me aside and asked, visibly shaken, if we had a history of trauma, or if Ethan had ever been through something like sleep paralysis or abuse, because he had described in detail a recurring event in which the lights would go off in his classroom and all the kids would become frozen, unable to move or speak. Except Ethan, who said a miss would call him to the front and make him repeat strange syllables in a language he didn't understand while the other children sat in silence, tears running down their cheeks, eyes blank. And the therapist said it was the most vivid and uniform shared delusion she'd ever encountered in a child, especially because at no point had we ever discussed the school or the drawing. At home, things got worse. Ethan began sleepwalking, always into corners, always facing the wall, always whispering a miss said not to look, and he'd wake up with nosebleeds or small scratches along his rib cage like he'd been poked repeatedly with a dull needle. And one night I caught him sitting upright in bed, his eyes completely white, no visible iris or pupil. And when I screamed his name, he smiled and said in a voice that wasn't his, a woman's voice, calm and cold, "Oh, you're not supposed to be here," before collapsing backward into sleep. I began digging through old yearbooks, staff directories, anything that might explain who Miss was or where she had come from. And in the archives at the public library, I found a newspaper clipping from 1977 about a teacher named Miss Alma Ellery who had disappeared along with an entire second-grade class during a field trip. No bodies were ever recovered, and the story was largely buried after a few months in Une. But the article mentioned her being fascinated by folklore and a ritualistic linguistics, something that made my skin crawl when I remembered the syllables Ethan had been forced to chant, and I began to wonder if Miss Ellery had found a way to continue her teaching beyond death, latching onto children through some gap in reality, some psychic fracture in the routine of classrooms, and now she had returned to my son's class, feeding off their obedience, their innocence, teaching them things they weren't meant to know. I tried to contact other parents, but most brushed me off or didn't respond, and the few who did mention that their kids had become withdrawn, quiet, plagued with nightmares they couldn't describe, and when I asked them to ask their children who their teacher was during the dark time, they all came back with the same answer. Miss, always whispered, never explained. Finally, I confronted the school board, demanded a full review, but the next day, before they could meet, the school caught fire under mysterious electrical conditions, destroying the classroom completely. And while no one was hurt, the timing was too perfect, too clean. They reassigned the kids and changed the curriculum. But Ethan hasn't been the same. He still wakes at exactly 2:13 p.m. every weekday, as if hearing an invisible bell, and stares into the corner of his room for exactly 13 minutes before returning to himself, and sometimes in those minutes, he hums a tune I've never heard, a tune I can't find anywhere online or in recordings, a tune that makes the dog whine and my stomach twist, and once, when I played it back on my phone, the recording was garbled with static and a voice. Unmistakably female, whispering, "I never graduate," and I realized whatever she is, wherever she comes from, she never left. She's part of him now, part of his classmates, maybe part of every classroom touched by her presence, and no fire or file purge will erase her. Every day I sit beside Ethan while he draws, always the same woman, always holding his hand, always smiling with a featureless face, and I don't know how to save him. I don't even know if I can, because how do you fight a teacher who doesn't exist anymore, who teaches through darkness, or teaches through darkness, who isn't made of flesh and blood, but something older, something structured, like a lesson plan carved into the bones of children, passed from student to student until there's nothing left but the voice of a miss, saying, "Today we learn silence." Story 3, Not My Son. The first time I realized something was wrong with my son Noah, I was brushing his hair before bed, a simple, intimate thing we did together each night, and I noticed a patch behind his left ear where the skin was. It was off, not bruised, not cut, but too smooth, like it had been stretched too tight or healed from something deeper than skin. And when I asked him if he'd bumped his head, he said no, but sometimes it itches when I wake up, and I chalked it up to eczema, or maybe an allergic reaction, nothing serious. Until a few weeks later when I found him in the hallway one night just standing there, barefoot, eyes wide open, but unseeing, his lips moving soundlessly in the dark. And when I whispered his name, he slowly turned to me and said in a voice completely flat and unfamiliar, "You're not supposed to be awake yet," before collapsing to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. And though the pediatrician said it was probably a night terror or a form of parasomnia, something about the coldness of his tone haunted me, as if whoever had spoken wasn't Noah at all. From that night on, I began noticing more subtle, creeping things, how he would sometimes use phrases I'd never heard him say before. Things no 8-year-old should say, like "I really like the old version of this room better," or "You changed your shampoo again," said with a frown like he was disappointed in me, and I started to feel like I was living with a stranger wearing my son's skin. My husband told me I was projecting, that I was under too much stress. But even he couldn't explain why Noah's drawings had shifted from simple houses and smiley stick perennials figures to detailed architectural diagrams of buildings he'd never seen, complete with measurements, ventilation layouts, and wiring plans he couldn't possibly understand. And when I asked him where he learned to draw like that, he just shrugged and said, "I don't know, almost." I remember things when I wake up, as if remembering was the same as learning. And that night I stayed up after he went to sleep, terrified, watching the baby monitor that we kept in his room for peace of mind. And I saw him sit up around 2:17 a.m., just like always. And instead of speaking gibberish or walking in circles like before, he looked directly into the camera lens, as if he knew I was watching, and mouthed something over and over again. Silent, deliberate, his eyes never blinking, and I recorded it back over and over, and realized he was mouthing the same phrase, "He's not gone, he's just deep," and I didn't know what that meant. Not then, not until I started digging. I went back through baby pictures, school photos, anything I could find, and that's when the real horror set in. Some of them didn't match. Not exactly, like a very subtle game of spot the difference. The curve of his ear off in one, the distance between his eyes slightly different in another. And I confronted my husband, demanded to know if there had been an accident, something he hadn't told me, some trauma that might explain it, and he swore nothing had ever happened, that I was scaring him with my obsession. And I was ready to believe him until the night Noah handed me a picture he'd drawn proudly of his inside place, and it wasn't a child's fantasy land or treehouse. It was a dark, hollow cavern filled with wires and pipes, with himself drawn at the center, suspended by strings with numbers written across his chest, 90,982, and I stared at that number for hours, something about it gnawing at me like a splinter in my brain, until I finally searched through hospital files, old paperwork, and I found something I didn't remember writing, an early medical form listing Noah's birth date as September 8th, not the 9th like we always celebrated. And when I pulled the birth certificate from the safe, I felt physically ill because the ink was smudged, the date overwritten, the doctor's name blacked out and corrected by hand. And worst of all, the hospital name was wrong, not the one where I gave birth, not even in the same county. And when I called that hospital, pretending to be requesting records, they told me, apologetically, that no child named Noah matching that date had ever been born there. I began to spiral, documenting everything. Recordings, drawings, patterned speech quirks, and every trail I followed led to dead ends or strange coincidences, like the fact that every 33 days without fail, Noah would suffer from a violent nosebleed at exactly 2:17 a.m., then sleep until sunrise, during which time his heart rate would dip dangerously low. Once so low I rushed him to the only for him to wake on the way, smiling and saying, "I went deeper this time," before vomiting a thick black fluid the doctors insisted was just a digested blood. Though they'd never seen anything quite like it, the final fracture happened after I installed a motion detection camera outside his room, desperate to see what happened during those windows of time. And on the third night, I saw something I can never unza. At 2:17 a.m., his door opened slowly, Amen Shahan. Its own and Noah, eyes still closed, walked backward into the hallway, arms outstretched like he was sleepwalking, and stood perfectly still for 13 minutes as something unseen by the camera but casting a shadow passed across the wall behind him, its shape massive, insectile, wrong. And when he returned to bed, he whispered clearly and softly, almost ready, as if to someone just outside the frame, "I went to the police, but they laughed me off, treated me like a hysterical mother with too much free time and an overactive imagination. So I turned to the only thing left, hypnotherapist, one who specialized in irrecovered memories. And after 3 sessions, he called me in private, pale and visibly shaken, and told me that Noah had described being unplugged in a place where children were attested, and that he believed, knew that he'd been inserted into my home after the real one went too far, and I collapsed onto the floor, unable to breathe, because those were my own secret words, the ones I'd said in the dark after a breakdown 2 years prior, when Noah had run into the street and I'd screamed at the sky. "You've gone too far," words I had never told anyone, least of all my child, and now here they were, echoed by something that looked like him, but remembered things he shouldn't, knew things I'd buried. And I no longer knew what he was, what I was living with. I kept him home from school, tried to stay by his side at all times, but he began withdrawing further. And then one night, I woke up to find every mirror in the house shattered, every single one, and Noah standing in the kitchen, barefoot, holding one of the broken shards and staring into the silvered glass with that same blank expression, whispering, "I found him. I found where they buried me," over and over. And when I screamed, he turned to me, tears rolling down his cheeks for the first time in months, and said, "But please don't make me go back inside. It's dark and it's full of teeth." And before I could speak, he collapsed, convulsing violently, and I cradled him in my arms, rocking him like a baby, whispering his name over and over. And he opened his eyes, smiled faintly, and said, "You're getting better at pretending before going completely still." He survived somehow, and the doctors found nothing. No cause, no damage, no answers. And now he sleeps through the nights again, perfectly normal, happy, balanced, but I know it isn't over, because sometimes I catch him watching me on while I sleep, face blank, lips mouthing things I can't hear. And when I ask him what he's doing, he just smiles and says, "Just checking if you're still my mommy." And every time he says it, I wonder if I am, if I ever really was, or if I too am something inserted, something tested. And neither of us remembers how or when it all began. Parenting is supposed to be one of the most human experiences, raw, messy, but filled with love. But as you've just heard, for some, it becomes a quiet descent into madness. A child that isn't really yours, a classroom that teaches the unspeakable, a face in your home that wears your son's smile, but isn't him. These stories aren't just about fear, they're about powerlessness. The unbearable truth that sometimes the horror isn't outside your home, it's sleeping under your roof. So tonight, when you hear your child's voice calling for you, listen closely, because it might not be them. Soft, eerie music fades and screen goes dark. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you want more terrifying true stories. Until next time, keep your doors locked. And whatever you do, don't ignore the things your child says in their sleep.